The vicar's parlour was bathed in the gentle glow of afternoon sunlight, the kind that streamed lazily through tall, mullioned windows and dusted the lace curtains with gold. Outside, the village of St. Elbridge lay quiet, as if even the birds were holding their breath in anticipation of the coming scandal. Inside, the vicar, Reverend Algernon Hargreaves, presided over a quaint tea-gathering, his silver tray polished to a mirror shine, delicate porcelain cups set with mathematical precision, and a plate of scones steaming invitingly on the lace-covered table. It was, by all appearances, a picture of domestic bliss, yet that serene scene was shattered with a single, incomprehensible twist. The moment the vicar excused himself to fetch a fresh pot of tea from the kitchen, Mrs. Beatrice Winslow, a long-time parishioner and regular guest at these gatherings, let out a strangled gasp. Everyone turned to find her pointing at the table. There, amidst the meticulously arranged cups and saucers, lay a small, intricately carved chess piece. A knight, standing upright on its own, inexplicably coated in what appeared to be blood. "Good heavens!" muttered the vicar, returning to the room, his eyes narrowing at the sight. "Where? How did that get there?" Nobody had touched the table since the tea began, or so they claimed. Mrs. Winslow's hands trembled as she recounted the moments leading up to the discovery. The room had been perfectly ordinary moments before. The tea steaming, the conversation light, the village gossip safe, and then the night. No one had seen anyone enter the room, no doors creaked, no windows rattled. The tray was untouched, the kettle remained hot on the stove, and yet here was a piece of a chess set coated in blood, standing like a silent sentinel. Inspector James Hawthorne, a man of calm demeanour and methodical mind, was called post-haste from the nearby station. He arrived in the late afternoon, taking in the scene with practised eyes, noting the heavy drapes drawn to one side, the faint aroma of Earl Grey lingering in the air, and the stiff tension among the small group of attendees. Each face reflected a mixture of curiosity and dread. "It's hardly what one expects at tea," he remarked, bending to inspect the chess piece more closely. "And yet—" his eyes lifted to meet theirs, steady and unreadable. "A crime may be hiding in plain sight," the vicar stammered, attempting explanations that all sounded inadequate. "It must be some prank. One of the children, perhaps." "No children were present," interjected Mrs. Winslow sharply. "Just us, grown-ups. And no one left the room." Inspector Hawthorne's brow furrowed. "Exactly, which is why it's worth considering that either someone is extraordinarily clever, or something unusual has occurred beyond the ordinary." He turned to the group, observing their reactions in minute detail. Mrs. Winslow's agitation, the vicar's discomfort, the quiet resignation of Mrs. Cartwright, who had been a close friend of the vicar for decades. Each person seemed to possess a shard of information they weren't sharing, and yet the piece remained the singular anomaly. The knight, oddly out of place, almost ornamental in its cruel symbolism. Then came a sound from the kitchen, a sharp thud, followed by a muffled cry. Everyone froze. The inspector motioned for silence and moved cautiously toward the door. Pushing it open, he found the kitchen floor clear, the kettle untouched, the drawers closed, but on the counter lay a note, neatly folded and stamped with a seal of deep red wax. Its message was brief, chilling. "The game has begun." No fingerprints, no indication of how it had appeared there. The note's presence, coupled with the knight on the tea table, created a puzzle seemingly lifted from a psychological thriller rather than a quiet village parlour. The inspector returned to the parlour, gathering the group once more. "Consider this carefully," he said, holding the chess piece between gloved fingers. "The knight is deliberate. It is a clue, but a misleading one. It suggests strategy, cunning, an opponent who thinks several moves ahead. And yet—" his eyes swept over the assembled faces. "The true challenge is discovering who among you plays this game for real, and who merely observes." The vicar clutched at his waistcoat, his voice trembling. "But who would do such a thing here, in my own home, in broad daylight?" "That," said the inspector quietly, "is what we are about to find out. And I suspect, Reverend, that appearances are far more deceptive than you imagine." As the group exchanged uneasy glances, the afternoon sunlight seemed to dim, shadows stretching across the polished floorboards. The crime was both impossibly simple and bafflingly complex. A single chess piece, a drop of blood, a sealed note, and the knowledge that in the quietest of villages danger could strike in the most ordinary of places. And so the unassuming parlour became the stage for a mystery that would challenge every assumption, test every relationship, and reveal that even over afternoon tea the darkest games could be played with deadly precision. The inspector's gaze lingered on the night, and a quiet certainty settled over the room. The answers were there, hidden in plain sight, but only the cleverest mind would uncover them. Inspector Hawthorne had barely finished speaking when the doorbell chimed again, announcing the arrival of someone whose presence would soon shift the entire tone of the investigation. Miss Jane Marple, the vicar's long-time acquaintance and a woman of keen observation, entered the parlour with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen far more than she ever let on. Her eyes, sharp and unassuming, swept over the group with a gentle but penetrating scrutiny, noting not just faces, but posture, tension, and the subtlest hints of unease. "Good afternoon," she said softly, inclining her head toward the vicar and his guests. "I hear there's a rather unusual development in your tea arrangements today." Her voice carried warmth, yet beneath it lingered the unmistakable undertone of inquiry. The vicar, still clutching his waistcoat, managed a nervous smile. "Yes, Miss Marple," he replied. "You see, a rather alarming thing has occurred. This chess piece appeared on the table, covered in blood, and no one claims to have placed it there." Miss Marple's gaze settled on the knight, tilting her head slightly as if examining a rare gem under a jeweller's lamp. "Indeed," she murmured, "an odd choice. Very deliberate, I would say. But the true puzzle lies not in the piece itself, but in the reactions it elicits." She moved slowly around the table, noting the positioning of each cup and saucer, the faint smudges of tea on the lace cloth, the subtle shift in floorboards where someone had clearly stood and then retreated. Her fingers brushed a small, otherwise unremarkable vase, and she paused. The vase was slightly off-centre, just enough to catch her attention. A fragment of something, perhaps a torn corner of paper, peeped from underneath it. Carefully she lifted the vase, revealing a thin strip of printed material, part of a letter, marked by a hurried scrawl in a hand that seemed oddly familiar. "Interesting," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. She replaced the vase precisely as it had been, noting the exact angles at which shadows fell. L across the floor, the way the light glinted off the silver tray. It's these minute details that often tell the story before words do. Hawthorne observed her with quiet respect, accustomed to methodical police procedure, but unaccustomed to such intuitive insight. While his men had already begun dusting for fingerprints and taking statements, Miss Marple was absorbing the invisible threads of human behaviour. She watched Mrs. Winslow's hands fidgeting with her gloves, the slight recoil of the vicar when certain questions were asked, and the curious, almost imperceptible glance exchanged between Mrs. Cartwright and a newcomer, the vicar's nephew, who had arrived earlier under the pretence of assisting with the tea service. "A chess piece and a note," she remarked, finally turning to Hawthorne. "Simple, yet meant to provoke fear and confusion. Observe how quickly attention is drawn to the obvious, blood, the piece, but how the subtler signs go unnoticed. People often overlook the ordinary, though it is in the ordinary that the extraordinary hides." Her eyes fell upon the vicar's own watch, slightly askew on the polished surface of a side table. The chain had a faint smear, barely visible, easily mistaken for a shadow. Kneeling, she examined it closely, discovering a tiny drop of the same blood that stained the night, as if someone had handled the watch after the piece had been touched. The vicar, noticing her inspection, stammered an explanation about polishing and dusting, but she merely nodded, filing away the detail. Then there was the subtle odour, a faint, almost imperceptible scent of almonds drifting in from the corner near the window. Miss Marple inhaled quietly. Cyanide? Possibly, but only in traces, enough to hint at intent rather than immediate danger. She let her gaze sweep the room again, taking in the positioning of chairs, the slight imbalance of the tea-tray, the angles at which the curtains had been drawn, and the faint scuff marks on the floor near the door to the kitchen. Each was a piece of the invisible puzzle, clues that were ignored by the more obvious methods of investigation. Hawthorne, noting her demeanour, asked, "Do you believe someone here is attempting deception?" Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. "I do not know yet who," she said, "but there are hints that all is not as it seems." Notice the way some are eager to speak, others too eager to remain silent, and a few who seem to speak truths laced with small, deliberate half-lies. The heart of the matter will reveal itself through patience and careful observation. She paused near the window, her gaze falling on the garden beyond, but her mind clearly running through scenarios unseen by others. A clever mind wishes to unsettle this household, to test boundaries and observe reactions. They have chosen their moment and their tools with precision. And yet, she said softly, almost to herself, they have underestimated the attention of one who notices what others ignore. With that, she straightened, her presence suddenly filling the room with quiet authority. The vicar's parlour, once simply the scene of an inexplicable prank, had become a theatre of suspicion, the first subtle threads of deception beginning to emerge, though the full tapestry remained obscured. Miss Marple's keen eyes had caught the first signs of the invisible game being played, and the room seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the revelation of the next move. The atmosphere in the vicarage had grown tense, a quiet pressure settling over the room as Inspector Hawthorne and Miss Marple prepared to question each of the attendees. The vicar, still pale and agitated, moved nervously from one chair to another, adjusting cushions and straightening cups as though order alone could ward off tea. A lingering sense of menace. Hawthorne began with Mrs. Winslow, asking her to recount exactly what she had witnessed. She spoke in clipped, breathless sentences, insisting she had been seated near the window, sipping her tea, when she noticed the night. "I didn't touch anything," she repeated, almost as if saying it enough times would make it true. "I was merely looking out at the garden, and then there it was." Miss Marple observed silently, noting the small tremor in her hands and the way her eyes darted toward the vicar whenever she paused. "You saw nothing else? No one moving around?" Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Winslow shook her head, but the inspector caught the subtle hesitation in her eyes. Next came Mrs. Cartwright, who had been quietly knitting in a corner. Her version of events was slightly different. She claimed to have been pouring tea for the vicar when she heard a thud in the kitchen. "I thought perhaps the kettle had slipped," she said, her voice steady but her fingers twisting the yarn tightly. "By the time I looked, everyone was gathered around the table." "And yet," Miss Marple said, "the kettle shows no disturbance, and the note was already on the counter. That is curious." She let the remark hang in the air, observing Mrs. Cartwright's subtle shift in posture. A flicker of unease crossed her composed face, before she quickly masked it with a smile. The vicar's nephew, a young man named Edward Hargreaves, was summoned next. He appeared flustered, adjusting his cravat and clearing his throat. I only came in to assist with the tea," he stammered, glancing between the inspector and Miss Marple. "I wasn't in the room when it happened, I swear it." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on him. "Yet you arrived earlier than usual, and no one recalls seeing you enter the kitchen. You handled the tray, did you not?" Edward hesitated, and for a fleeting moment his fingers clenched. "I may have moved it slightly, but the chess piece, I didn't touch that." His eagerness to exonerate himself, coupled with his hesitation, was noted carefully. Hawthorne turned his attention to the vicar. "Reverend, you were away only briefly?" The vicar nodded, fidgeting with the buttons of his waistcoat. "I went to fetch the second pot of tea. I assure you nothing happened while I was gone." Yet his voice wavered, and the inspector detected the faintest avoidance when asked about the exact moment he left the room. Miss Marple, sensing the tension, leaned forward. "It is remarkable how the simplest of events can reveal so much when one listens closely. Notice how each of you recalls the sequence slightly differently, not because you lie intentionally, but because a small anxiety, fear perhaps, distorts memory. And yet," she added, her gaze piercing, "sometimes a distortion masks deliberate concealment." She moved to the window and gestured toward the garden. "Consider the path of the sun, the angle of shadows, the position of chairs and the tea tray. Each of you has an account, but none aligns perfectly with what the room itself reveals." Her voice was calm, yet her observation carried an undeniable weight. Mrs. Winslow's hands tightened around her gloves. "But we were all there the whole time," she protested. "How can it have happened without anyone seeing?" "Precisely why someone wishes you to believe that," Miss Marple said softly. "The perpetrator relies on the assumption that you will not notice the minor inconsistencies. Small lies are easier to hide when everyone is distracted by a dramatic event." Edward shifted in his seat again, clearly uncomfortable under her scrutiny. I didn't do anything. I only wanted to help." Miss Marple tilted her head, observing him as though reading a complex manuscript. "Help is often sincere," she said gently, "but the timing of your arrival and your repeated insistence upon innocence suggests that there is more you wish to withhold than you realize." Hawthorne scribbled notes rapidly, the contradictions piling up, Mrs. Winslow's varying recollections, Mrs. Cartwright's unexplained detail about the thud, Edward's nervous defensiveness, and even the vicar's subtle evasions. Every small discrepancy, every tremor in the voice or hesitation in the eyes, pointed to hidden motives. As the questioning continued, Miss Marple's mind worked silently, connecting fragments of truth and deception. The chess piece, the note, the slight smear on the vicar's watch, they were not random, nor merely intended to frighten. They were deliberate signals planted by someone who understood both the physical environment and the psychology of the witnesses. By the time the afternoon light began to wane, the room was thick with tension. The inspector's methodical procedure had uncovered contradictions, but it was Miss Marple who had begun to unravel the subtle threads of deception. Each witness carried a piece of the puzzle, though some pieces were shaped to mislead. And though the full picture remained hidden, one certainty emerged. Someone in the vicarage was playing a careful, calculated game, and every word, every gesture, and every contradiction was part of their strategy. The quiet village parlour had transformed into a web of secrets, and the game was only just beginning. Miss Marple remained silent for a moment after the last of the questioning, letting the hum of the vicarage settle around her. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the parlour, and the small group of witnesses seemed to shrink under the weight of unspoken suspicions. She finally spoke, her voice calm but deliberate. "One must always consider why someone acts, not just what they do. Motives are rural, are singular. They intertwine, twist, and overlap until one can scarcely tell where one ends and another begins." Hawthorne nodded, accustomed to procedure but aware that intuition was guiding her observations in ways his charts and timelines could not. "Are you suggesting that all of them might have reason to act?" he asked quietly. "Exactly," Miss Marple said, "and it is in that tangle of motivations that the truth lies hidden. Let us consider each carefully." She started with the vicar himself. Reverend Hargreaves, outwardly mild-mannered and devoted to his parish, had a comfortable life, yet Miss Marple had already noticed the faint tremor in his hands when asked about the precise time he left the room. The vicar had recently received a letter regarding the sale of church property, a sum significant enough to stir greed or fear. Could he have orchestrated the scene to cover something that would damage him if revealed? Mrs. Winslow, on the other hand, presented a more subtle motive. Though she appeared flustered and anxious, Miss Marple noted an undercurrent of envy in her demeanour. She had long been a close friend of the vicar, attending countless teas, yet she never seemed to receive the same degree of attention or favour. Perhaps jealousy, though petty at first glance, could evolve into action if she felt slighted or overlooked. Mrs. Cartwright's calm, almost mechanical responses suggested a mind used to restraint, yet Miss Marple recalled that she had been involved in a dispute over a bequest left by a late parishioner, a dispute unresolved and simmering quietly. Revenge, in this case, might not be immediate or violent, but it could manifest in subtle intimidation. The placement of a chess piece, the cryptic note, a message meant to unsettle. Edward Hargreaves, the vicar's nephew, was the most volatile of all. He had appeared eager to exonerate himself, almost de fait. Civilly so, yet Miss Marple could sense the conflict in his posture and voice. He had been living in relative dependence on his uncle's support, his inheritance uncertain, and his impatience thinly veiled behind manners and stammered denials. Fear of exposure, combined with a desire for security and perhaps entitlement, made him a plausible participant in the scheme. Even the household itself, the seemingly innocent furnishings, the precise alignment of trays and curtains, the position of the chess pieces, hinted at calculated interference. Each person interacted with the objects in the room differently, revealing tendencies toward order, control, or subtle subterfuge. Miss Marple mentally mapped the connections, noting who would benefit from confusion, who might act impulsively, and who could manipulate perception with calm precision. Hawthorne paced, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Every one of them has something to gain, or fear losing. But how do we determine who acted and who merely had a motive? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Observation, patience, and the smallest details often illuminate what grand theories cannot. A motive, while compelling, requires opportunity and subtlety. Not everyone who wishes to act can do so without leaving traces, nor does everyone who leaves a trace do so consciously. She returned to the chess piece, turning it over lightly between her fingers. The knight's odd position, the slight smear of blood, the note on the counter, all were deliberate signals. Someone wished to frighten, perhaps to manipulate, but the act itself was too controlled to be spontaneous. The interplay of greed, jealousy, revenge, and fear had created a tangled web, and each suspect had a thread connecting them to the act. Yet which thread bore the weight of intent? Miss Marple's gaze moved from one face to another, reading not what they said, but what they ought to hide. The vicar's discomfort hinted at secrets involving his affairs and finances. Mrs. Winslow's tremor betrayed a longing for recognition or influence. Mrs. Cartwright's poised calm masked simmering resentment, and Edward's nervousness carried a selfish, impatient undertone. Each thread alone explained part of the puzzle, but none accounted for the precision of the stage scene, the cryptic note, and the carefully placed piece. "The puzzle is never in a single motive," she murmured. "It is in their intersections. Only by tracing the points where fear, envy, and ambition collide can we begin to understand the full design. And that design," she added softly, "is only now beginning to emerge." Hawthorne felt a shiver of anticipation. The tangled maze of motives was not yet unravelled, but with Miss Marple's insight, the invisible lines connecting the suspects were slowly coming into focus. Somewhere in this quiet, sunlit parlour, the person who had orchestrated the deception was hiding in plain sight, their intentions masked by ordinary behaviour, waiting for the wrong assumption to reveal them. And it was only a matter of time before those lines of motive and opportunity converged, exposing the mind behind the deadly game. The following morning, the vicarage seemed to hum with a fragile sense of resolution. Inspector Hawthorne, satisfied with his officer's collection of evidence, called the group together in the sunlit parlour. He held aloft a small, folded envelope, the discovery of which he announced with triumph. "We have found a partial fingerprint on the note," he declared, matching Edward Hargreaves. "It seems the matter is resolved. The perpetrator is in our custody." Edward's face paled, and he stammered out protestations, insisting he had touched nothing except the tray earlier in the day. Yet the presence of the fingerprint seemed incontrovertible to the inspector and the assembled guests. Mrs. Winslow let out a small sigh of relief as if the crisis had finally ended, while Mrs. Cartwright nodded curtly, her composure regained. Even the vicar seemed almost buoyant, as though he could once again enjoy his tea in peace. Miss Marple, however, remained seated near the window, her knitting still in her lap, but her fingers idle. She held the knight loosely in one hand, turning it slowly between her fingers. The triumph in the room did not reach her eyes. Something was wrong. The fingerprint was indeed Edward's, she noted, but the precision of the placement, the timing of the note, and the subtle orchestration of the scene did not feel like the work of a panicked or impulsive hand. Hawthorne, sensing her hesitation, frowned. "Miss Marple, surely you see, this resolves everything." She shook her head slowly. "Not everything, Inspector. The fingerprint is real, yes, but the circumstances surrounding it are too neat, too predictable. The note, the night, the timing, these point to a mind that knows precisely how evidence will be interpreted. I do not doubt Edward's presence near the tray, but I doubt he is the true author of this scheme." Hawthorne raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting we have apprehended the wrong person?" "Not exactly," she said, standing and moving to the table to examine the scene once more. "Edward may have handled the note. He may even have assisted unknowingly in placing it where it would be discovered. But the orchestration, the deliberate placement of the night, the careful smearing of blood, the cryptic phrasing, is the work of someone far more deliberate, someone capable of thinking several moves ahead. The true mind behind this has yet to reveal itself." The inspector's confidence faltered slightly. He looked at Edward, whose hands now shook with fear and confusion. "But the fingerprint," he began. "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "The fingerprint is a convenient piece of the puzzle, perhaps even intentionally left to mislead. It is the classic diversion. A false victory meant to give the impression that the case is closed while the real culprit watches from the shadows. The room grew silent. Even the vicar, who had been attempting to relax with a cup of tea, stiffened. Mrs. Winslow's lips pressed together tightly, and Mrs. Cartwright's gaze sharpened. The sense of security that had settled with the inspector's announcement dissipated like mist. Miss Marple continued, her eyes sweeping the room. Notice how quickly relief replaced careful observation, how readily assumptions were made based on a single piece of evidence. That is exactly what the orchestrator counted on. And they remain here, in this very house, perhaps even seated among us, waiting for the chaos to subside before making their next move. Edward, realizing the implications, looked up with a mixture of fear and desperation. I didn't do it! I swear I only moved the note. I didn't think. You are not yet accused of the full act, Miss Marple said gently, but you have been used as a tool. That is what clever manipulators do. They anticipate reactions, exploit weaknesses, and plant evidence where it will lead to predictable conclusions. Inspector Hawthorne rubbed his temples, unsettled but intrigued. Then we continue? Yes, she replied. Patience is required. Observe, question, and note the small details. The true criminal is still active, still observing, and still confident. Our task is to see what they cannot hide, to catch the moment when their cleverness betrays them. A hush settled over the vicarage. The false sense of victory had dissolved, replaced by the quiet awareness that the game was far from over. Outside, the sun slanted lower, elongating shadows across the parlour floor. So, me where among them, the mind behind the staged crime waited, calculating, confident, and undetected. Miss Marple's sharp eyes, however, had already begun to trace the faintest, almost imperceptible threads that would ultimately unravel the cunning plan. And so, while the authorities might celebrate an early conclusion, the true investigation was only just beginning, with danger and deception still lurking quietly behind polite smiles and carefully chosen words. Miss Marple remained in the vicarage long after the others had dispersed for the evening, the fading sunlight casting shadows across the parlour like fingers stretching across the floor. While Inspector Hawthorne and his team had retreated to the station with Edward in tow, she lingered, her keen eyes tracing the minutiae of the room, the angle of the curtains, the faint scratches on the sideboard, the subtle discoloration along the edges of the lace tablecloth. And then her gaze landed on something she had not noticed before, a small, worn photograph tucked into the corner of the vicar's bookshelf. It was a picture from decades past, yellowed at the edges, depicting a gathering of villagers at a church fete. Among the faces was one strikingly familiar, a young Mrs. Cartwright, her arm linked with a man whose features Miss Marple immediately recognized as the late Mr. Winslow, Beatrice's long-deceased husband. A subtle realization stirred in her mind, the quiet animosities, the polite deference, the subtle undercurrents of envy and resentment were not new. They had origins that stretched back far beyond today's afternoon tea. She took the photograph down carefully, inspecting, alongside a set of letters stored in the vicar's desk drawer. One letter, forgotten and fraying, was addressed to the vicar and referenced a dispute over parish funds, but more tellingly, it alluded to a scandal involving both Mrs. Winslow and Mrs. Cartwright. There had been accusations, whispered secrets, and injuries to reputations that were never formally resolved. The seeds of resentment and ambition planted years ago had clearly not faded, they had only lain dormant, waiting for an opportune moment to surface. Miss Marple's mind moved swiftly, piecing together the fragments of the past with the events of the present. The chess piece, the cryptic note, the false fingerprint, they were all part of a plan executed not by a single person acting impulsively, but by someone intimately familiar with the dynamics of this small, interwoven circle. It was no random act, it was a carefully timed expression of long-standing grievances, a way to unsettle the vicarage while concealing deeper motives that had festered for decades. Returning to the parlour, she re-examined the subtle tensions she had observed earlier, Mrs. Winslow's tremors, Mrs. Cartwright's composed demeanour, the vicar's quiet nervousness. The connections became clear. Mrs. Winslow, motivated by lingering jealousy and unresolved anger from her husband's disputes with the vicar, had found an ally, or at least a convenient scapegoat, in Mrs. Cartwright, whose own grievances and knowledge of the parish's inner workings allowed her to manipulate events with precision. Their motives, separate yet entwined, converged in a single calculated design. Miss Marple made her way to the sideboard, noting the faint marks where the knight had been placed on the table, and a realization struck her. The crime had been staged to create the illusion of impulsiveness, but the orchestration required knowledge of not only the room itself, but also the predictable behaviors of its occupants. The choice of the knight was symbolic, suggesting strategy and deliberate movement, a clue meant to misdirect those who lacked patience or subtlety. Whoever had orchestrated this understood the personalities involved and had engineered the scene to manipulate assumptions. She pulled a journal from the vicar's desk, its pages detailing parish events over many years. The entries revealed recurring incidents of minor intrigue, misplaced documents, odd coincidences, veiled threats, all of which now seemed to be connected to the present crime. The events of today were not an isolated act of mischief, they were the culmination of decades of hidden resentment, carefully stored in memory and recalled at precisely the right moment to achieve maximum effect. Miss Marple paused, holding the photograph and letters in her hands. The web of relationships was intricate. Old alliances, hidden enmities, and secrets carefully nurtured to remain invisible until a situation demanded their re-emergence. Today's crime was not merely about the chess piece or the note. It was about bringing the weight of the past into the present, using long-forgotten grievances to manipulate the living, and exploiting their reactions to create the illusion of chaos. A faint creak from the hallway made her glance up, and she caught sight of Edward standing in the doorway, uncertain and hesitant. "Miss Marple," he whispered, "I don't understand. It wasn't me, was it?" "No, dear boy," she said gently. "You are merely a piece on the board, moved without your consent. The player is someone far older, far more practiced, and far more patient than you ever imagined. But now we know where to look. The past has left its fingerprints here, and by tracing them, we shall uncover the mind that has waited all these years for the perfect moment to strike." The shadows lengthened, enveloping the parlour in half-light, but within those shadows clarity began to form. Miss Marple could see the outline of the scheme, the hidden connections between suspects and the quiet pulse of intent that had lain dormant. Until today, the past and present had merged in a delicate, dangerous pattern, and now, at last, the game could be unravelled. The next morning Miss Marple returned to the vicarage, her presence quiet but resolute. The parlour, bathed in a soft grey light from the overcast sky, seemed calmer than the day before, yet the tension lingered in the very air. She had spent the night reviewing her observations, considering the tangled web of motives, and now she intended to draw out the hidden truths using a method far removed from conventional police procedure. Instead of questioning suspects directly, she set the table once more for tea. Cups were arranged meticulously, the silver tray gleaming, and the chessboard, a silent observer, was positioned in the centre. She did not announce a formal inquiry. Rather, she invited the vicar and his guests to join her for what seemed a casual morning tea. "Let us play a game," she said lightly, though her eyes hinted at calculation. "A game of perception and memory, nothing sinister, merely a small test to pass the time." The group exchanged uncertain glances, but curiosity outweighed hesitation. They sat, cups in hand, as Miss Marple began subtly guiding the conversation toward the events of the previous day. She spoke not of guilt but of details: the position of the knight, the appearance of the note, the precise time of arrival for each participant. She did so with the gentlest of inquiries, phrasing each remark as observation rather than accusation. Her strategy was simple but effective. People often reveal more in attempts to correct, embellish, or clarify seemingly trivial details than they do when directly interrogated. As the discussion continued, Miss Marple presented a minor but pointed challenge. She casually rearranged a few objects on the table and, with a delicate smile, asked, "Does anything seem different to you? The same items, the same positions, but perhaps something has shifted." All eyes scanned the table, but it was Mrs. Cartwright who reacted first. Her gaze flicked sharply, and her fingers hovered tensely over her teacup. I don't see anything," she murmured, a faint quiver in her voice betraying her composure. Miss Marple allowed a pause, letting the silence stretch. "Ah, but you notice, do you not?" she said softly. "Even slight changes can disturb some more than others. It is not always what is moved, but how one reacts to it that speaks volumes." Mrs. Cartwright's hands tightened on her knitting, and a small flush crept across her cheeks. She forced a polite cough and averted her eyes, but Miss Marple's sharp observation caught the subtle hesitation, the tiny flicker of discomfort, a crack in a previously unbroken facade. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, addressing no one in particular. "Some are quick to observe, some slower, and some slower still, but revealing in their own way." Her eyes rested on Mrs. Winslow next. The older woman's fingers trembled lightly as she lifted her teacup, and when she spoke, it was to overemphasize her certainty. "Everything seems as it should," she said firmly, a touch too loudly. Miss Marple's strategy was working. The psychological pressure of minor, harmless manipulation had elicited reactions that were telling. Each person's response, or over-response, was a reflection not of guilt alone, but of anxiety, awareness, and the fear of being observed. It was a method far subtler than confrontation, and yet it had already begun to reveal cracks in the carefully maintained appearances. Hawthorne, watching from a corner, leaned closer to Miss Marple. "I do not understand," he whispered. "Nothing has changed. How does this tell you anything?" She smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving the suspects. The smallest disruptions provoke the truth. A mind accustomed to hiding, to manipulating, reacts to unexpected, controlled variations. One cannot fake the instinctive awareness of danger or the overcompensation to conceal it. As she continued, she introduced another minor irregularity. She asked the group to recall the precise sequence of the tea service from the day before. Most faltered, but Mrs. Cartwright hesitated longest, revising details mid-sentence, contradicting herself subtly yet repeatedly. Even the vicar, ordinarily composed, showed small signs of unease when pressed on timing. Miss Marple took careful note of these inconsistencies. Finally, she allowed the conversation to flow back to ordinary matters, yet the clues had been planted and observed. Mrs. Cartwright's nervous adjustments, the forced certainty of Mrs. Winslow, the vicar's slight evasions, all spoke to hidden knowledge and intentional manipulation. Miss Marple had employed an unconventional tactic, a psychological probe rather than a direct accusation, and in doing so, she had coaxed the first undeniable signs of deception. On into the open, a soft chime from the vicarage clock marked the passage of time, but in that quiet room the game had already shifted. Miss Marple's keen eye had isolated subtle truths within ordinary behaviours. Somewhere within the calm facade of polite conversation, the true architect of the chess piece, the note and the fear that had gripped the vicarage, was beginning to reveal themselves, not through confession, but through the unmistakable involuntary signals of a mind attempting to remain concealed. The afternoon sun had begun to sink low, casting long golden streaks across the vicarage floor, when a sudden commotion drew Miss Marple and Inspector Hawthorne back into the parlour. One of the constables had burst in, pale and flustered, announcing in clipped tones that the crucial evidence, the chess knight and the note, was missing. The tray upon which the knight had been carefully placed was empty, the note nowhere to be found. The lace tablecloth had been adjusted, as if someone had made a deliberate effort to remove traces of their intrusion. The vicar, aghast, grasped the edge of the table, his knuckles whitening. "Impossible!" he exclaimed. "No one has entered this room except ourselves." Hawthorne's face tightened. "Impossible? Only if we assume the room is secure. Clearly, someone has been here after us. Someone clever, patient, and aware of the value of these items." Miss Marple's expression remained composed, though her eyes were sharp, scanning every corner and shadow. She noted faint scuff marks along the polished floorboards, the subtle displacement of a chair near the window, and the faint scent of perfume, strong, floral, and unfamiliar, that had not been present before. Whoever had taken the evidence had done so deliberately, leaving only the most subtle traces, yet enough for a careful observer to notice. The implications were immediate and chilling. The thief had not acted out of panic or haste, but with purpose and knowledge of the investigation. They understood that the chess piece and note were key to unravelling the mystery, and by removing them, they had disrupted the momentum. The crime was no longer merely a riddle, it had become a battle of wits, with the players shifting roles from suspects to potential saboteurs. Hawthorne turned to the vicar and his guests. "No one left the house?" he demanded, his voice firm. "Certainly not," Mrs. Winslow replied, her tone a mixture of indignation and fear. Mrs. Cartwright nodded silently, while Edward appeared nervously at the back of the room. His face pale. Miss Marple walked slowly toward the window, her fingers brushing along the sill. "No one need have left the house," she murmured. "It is quite possible the evidence was removed by someone who was already present, who moved under the guise of ordinary activity, or who simply waited until attention was elsewhere." Her eyes flicked to the open window. A faint draught stirred the curtains. The scuff marks on the floor led from the sideboard toward the doorway, yet there was no sign of forced entry. Whoever had taken the night and note had either been trusted or had cunningly exploited the routines of those present. "Do you think it could have been Edward?" Hawthorne asked, his scepticism evident. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Edward is far too anxious to act with such calculated subtlety. The mind behind this is calm, patient, and familiar with the habits of everyone here. Observe how carefully the theft was executed. There is no hurried hand, no careless error. Only someone who knows the terrain, the people, and the importance of the objects removed could accomplish this." The vicar's voice trembled. Then who? How can we trust anyone here?" Miss Marple allowed a moment of silence, letting the weight of her words settle. "Trust is always a fragile thing in matters such as these," she said softly. "But we observe, we record, and we watch. The thief has made a bold move, revealing both audacity and knowledge. They believe they can bury the truth, but in doing so they have also revealed themselves to careful eyes." Hawthorne frowned, scanning the room. "So the game continues, and we are left without our key evidence?" "Not entirely," Miss Marple replied, her gaze flicking to the subtle traces. "The scuff marks, the perfume, the shift in chair placement. These are small, almost invisible, but they are clues nonetheless. Evidence need not always be an object. Sometimes the pattern of its absence speaks louder than the object itself." A heavy silence fell. The parlour, once the scene of an orderly investigation, had become a theatre of tension. Every glance, every gesture, now carried the weight of potential deception. The chess piece and note might be gone, but the game had only intensified. Miss Marple could feel the presence of the true manipulator lurking, confident that their removal of the evidence had put them one step ahead. Yet she also knew that even the most careful deception left traces for the perceptive, and she had only to follow the faintest threads to uncover the mind that sought to remain hidden. Outside, the shadows deepened, and the vicarage seemed to hold its breath. The stakes had risen. The true criminal was no longer just scheming. They were actively shaping events, daring anyone to catch them before the next move. And Miss Marple, with her patient, unerring eye, was determined to do exactly that. The evening air had grown chill as dusk settled over the village, and the vicarage, once tranquil, now seemed fraught with an almost tangible tension. Miss Marple and Inspector Hawthorne were discussing the missing night and note, when a sudden sharp cry echoed from the hallway. Both turned in unison to see the vicar staggering toward them, his face ashen and eyes wide with panic. "Miss Marple! Inspector, it's Edward!" he gasped, clutching the edge of a chair to steady himself. "He's gone. I don't know where he is." Hawthorne sprang to his feet. "Gone? How? Was he not under observation?" "I left him in the library for only a few minutes," the vicar stammered, his hands shaking. "And when I returned, nothing. Just the chair where he had been seated. Empty." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The situation had shifted dramatically. The supposed false suspect, already anxious and vulnerable, had vanished entirely, leaving behind only the echo of his presence. The disappearance could not be dismissed as coincidence. Whoever orchestrated the initial crime had anticipated the investigation, and now they had escalated, demonstrating both audacity and foresight. The search began immediately, yet the vicarage offered few clues. Doors were locked, windows secure, and no footprints or signs of forced entry were found outside. Even the small, scuff-marked trail from the earlier evidence theft ended abruptly in the hallway, as if the intruder had slipped away without a trace. Miss Marple Sm's mind raced, weaving together the strands she had been following, the lingering resentments, the historical grievances, the calculated theft of the night and note. It was clear now that the criminal was operating not merely to conceal past deeds, but to manipulate events in real time, using fear, anticipation, and psychological pressure to control the narrative. She turned to Hawthorne. "This is no ordinary disappearance. Whoever took Edward intended it to be seen as mysterious, perhaps even accidental, yet the pattern is deliberate. Consider the timing, the theft of the night and note, followed by this vanishing. Each step is calculated to draw attention, mislead, and instill urgency. The person responsible is testing us, observing our reactions, and they remain several steps ahead. Hawthorne, though unsettled, began coordinating a perimeter search, instructing officers to cover the grounds and surrounding streets. Yet even as the constables fanned out, Miss Marple noticed the smallest, seemingly inconsequential details, the slight disturbance of dust on the library floor, a faint trace of perfume lingering near the doorway, and the subtle indentation on the chair where Edward had been seated, suggesting he had been moved forcibly rather than leaving voluntarily. Her instincts told her that Edward was still in the house, or at least close by. The criminal had used the environment and the predictability of human behavior to orchestrate a controlled escalation. Whoever it was had intimate knowledge of the vicarage, its routines, and the reactions of its occupants. As she inspected the library, Miss Marple's sharp eye caught something easily overlooked. A small, nearly imperceptible scratch along the edge of a side table, angled in a way that suggested a hurried movement toward the rear of the room. More tellingly, the faint reflection of a glass pane revealed that the vicarage's servant corridor, a narrow, seldom used passage behind the kitchen, had been traversed recently. The criminal had clearly used hidden knowledge of the building's layout to vanish and reappear unseen. "The game has changed," she murmured. "The first act was to unsettle and mislead. This second act is to intimidate and manipulate. Edward's disappearance is both a warning and a test. We must now anticipate moves rather than merely react to them." Hawthorne glanced at her, concern etched across his face. "You mean another crime is possible? That the villain will strike again?" Miss Marple nodded, her eyes calm yet resolute. "Precisely. And the only way to prevent it is to recognize patterns, trace the subtle clues, and predict intentions. Whoever orchestrated this does not act blindly. They act with precision, timing, and patience. If we hope to safeguard Edward and uncover the truth, we must think like them." The parlour, once a scene of polite afternoon tea, had transformed into a theatre of high-stakes deception. Outside, shadows deepened with the encroaching night, and within the vicarage, tension mounted. The criminal remained unseen, confident in their advantage, yet Miss Marple, with her unerring eye and patient intellect, had begun to trace the faintest threads of their strategy. The disappearance of Edward was not merely a complication, it was a signal, a challenge, and a test of skill, and she knew that, unless the right move was made, the stakes could escalate further, with consequences none in the room could afford to ignore. Miss Marple sat quietly in the dim light of the vicarage parlour, the events of the past day replaying in her mind like pieces of a slowly revealing puzzle. The theft of the night and note, Edward's disappearance, the subtle reactions of the vicar and his guests. Each had seemed chaotic and disconnected at the time, yet she sensed a hidden order beneath the apparent disorder. What had appeared to be a series of impulsive acts was in truth a carefully choreographed sequence, designed to manipulate, intimidate, and mislead. Her attention returned to the objects on the table, the remaining chess pieces, the teacups, even the arrangement of the silver tray. Something had felt off earlier, an imperceptible irregularity she had filed away in her mind. Now, with the full context of the day's events, it began to crystallize. It was the position of the bishop, leaning slightly toward the edge of the board, as if to gesture toward the vicar's desk. The shift had seemed accidental, a minor detail, but Miss Marple realized it was deliberate, a subtle signpost left by the criminal, almost mocking in its simplicity, yet containing a message for the perceptive observer. She thought back to the earlier psychological probe over tea, the small rearrangements she had made and the reactions they had elicited. Mrs. Cartwright's nervous glance at the moving objects, Mrs. Winslow's overemphasis on certainty, Edward's trembling hands, all were part of a pattern. The criminal had counted on distraction, on assumptions, on ordinary behaviours being misread or ignored. Each reaction had been a thread, and now, by following them, she could trace the design with startling clarity. It was then that her mind returned to the photograph she had discovered days earlier, the one depicting Mrs. Cartwright with the late Mr. Winslow, the old connection between the families, the long smouldering grievances, and the repeated small incidents recorded in the vicar's journal. All of these elements had seemed tangential until now. The seemingly minor disputes, the whispered resentments, the small misdirections, they were not random. They were the foundation for today's drama, the emotional architecture upon which the criminal had built the scheme. Miss Marple rose and moved deliberately toward the vicar's desk, inspecting the drawers, the papers, and the slight indentation on one of the shelves. There it was, the detail she had overlooked, a tiny scratch at the corner of the writing surface, just enough to suggest that something had been lifted and replaced. The mark was subtle, almost invisible, yet it aligned perfectly with the subtle nudge of the bishop earlier, pointing to the same locati. The pattern had been laid out in plain sight, hidden in plain view, as if the criminal had assumed no one would notice the minutiae of gesture, position, and habit. Hawthorne entered the room quietly, looking for Miss Marple. "Have you found anything?" he asked, noting her focused demeanour. "Patience, Inspector," she said softly, her eyes scanning the room. "The pattern emerges when we view all the details together. The chess pieces, the note, Edward's disappearance, the minor disturbances. They form a map, guiding us toward the truth." She gestured toward the sideboard near the window. "Consider the timeline, the night stolen first, then the psychological tests, then Edward's removal. Each act is both a distraction and a signal," pointing toward the vicar's desk, the very place where long-standing secrets have been stored, and where the orchestrator anticipated we would eventually look. "It has been visible all along, if one knew how to interpret the signs." Hawthorne leaned in, trying to follow her reasoning. "You mean the criminal left clues deliberately, expecting someone to notice?" "Exactly," Miss Marple replied, "but they relied on subtlety, trusting that ordinary observers would dismiss them as accidental or trivial. It is a test of perception. And now that we see the pattern, we understand the rhythm of their design. Every move, every hesitation, every misplaced gesture is part of a calculated sequence." Her gaze swept the room one last time, resting on the remaining suspects. The careful arrangement of objects, the nervous adjustments of Mrs. Cartwright, the slight overconfidence of Mrs. Winslow, all were now intelligible as elements of a larger scheme. The chaos of the day had concealed the order of the criminal's mind, but with the pattern emerging, Miss Marple could finally anticipate the next move. The vicarage, once a scene of confusion and fear, now he. LD a new clarity for her eyes. The criminal's strategy had been audacious, manipulative, and precise, yet even the most clever deception leaves traces when observed attentively, and Miss Marple, with patience and careful observation, had begun to see the full outline of the plan. The invisible threads were coming together, and at last the hidden structure behind the crime could be traced from beginning to end. Miss Marple gathered the small group in the parlour once again, her calm demeanour concealing the intensity of her focus. The evening had grown long, shadows stretching across the walls like dark fingers, and the air was heavy with anticipation. Edward, pale and anxious, remained seated near the fireplace, while the vicar and the others watched her with a mix of curiosity and unease. She knew that the time had come to confront not only the evidence, but the hidden psychological currents that had driven the crime. "My friends," she began, her voice gentle but unwavering, "we have traced the sequence of events, examined the subtle traces, and discerned the pattern of the perpetrator's actions. What remains now is to understand the reason, the true motive that guided these deeds, for that motive is not the obvious one." A tense silence fell. Mrs. Winslow fidgeted with her gloves, Mrs. Cartwright adjusted her shawl, and even the vicar's composure seemed brittle. Miss Marple let her gaze sweep the room slowly, then fixed on Mrs. Cartwright. "It is not merely envy, nor the petty grievances of the past. Those are but the surface of a much deeper current. The true motive is a desire for control, not of wealth or influence, but of the minds and fates of those around you. Mrs. Cartwright's hands froze in her lap, and her calm mask faltered. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible shiver. I don't understand," she whispered. Miss Marple leaned forward, her knitting idle in her lap. "You sought to manipulate, to frighten, to orchestrate events in such a manner that others would act according to your design. The chess piece, the note, Edward's disappearance, all were means to measure reactions, to bend perception, to exercise authority over human behavior. You derived satisfaction not merely from revenge or gain, but from the subtle power of shaping others' responses, observing the consequences of your orchestration." Mrs. Cartwright's lips pressed thinly, and her eyes darted to the chessboard at the centre of the room. She had chosen that piece carefully, Miss Marple realized, because the knight, with its indirect, unconventional movement, symbolized the very strategy she had employed: moves unseen, paths unanticipated, influence exercised with precision. Mrs. Winslow's voice trembled, though she tried to sound composed. But surely there was more at stake than mere amusement. She would not go so far without reason. Miss Marple nodded. "Of course. Yet the reason is psychological rather than material. The orchestrator craves the affirmation of intellect over circumstance, the thrill of seeing one's understanding of human nature enacted in reality. It is not the money, nor the church property, nor the long-standing grievances alone. It is the mastery of events themselves. That is why the risk escalated: theft, disappearance, misdirection. Each act tested the limits of both the orchestrator and the participants, measuring control and precision." The vicar gasped, clutching his chair. But Edward, he was endangered." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly, "that is the darkness of the motivation. To the orchestrator, the potential harm was secondary to the proof of control, to the demonstration that the game could be played, the pieces moved, and the reactions predicted. The danger, the fear, the tension, all of it was a measure, a gauge of influence. And therein lies the moral perversity of the act. It is calculated cruelty master's strategy." Mrs. Cartwright's hands twitched, her composed exterior now clearly cracking. I only wanted to see if they would respond as expected," she stammered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and something close to exhilaration. "I never meant. I only wanted to—" Miss Marple's expression softened, though her voice remained firm. "Yet intention, even if devoid of physical harm, does not lessen the moral weight. You used the past, the grievances, the psychological patterns of those around you to create a scenario in which fear and manipulation were instruments. That is the true motive. Power over perception, mastery over behavior, and the satisfaction of watching one's predictions unfold. It is a subtle but profound obsession." Hawthorne, absorbing the revelation, shook his head. "I've dealt with greed and revenge, envy and ambition, but never this—" "No," Miss Marple said, her gaze steady. "This is different. Ordinary motives can be traced, compensated, or appeased. But a motive rooted in the desire to orchestrate human action, to bend minds and emotions to one's design, is far more insidious. It drives behavior to extremes, just as we have seen here: theft, disappearance, deception, all acts meant to affirm the orchestrator's mastery." Mrs. Cartwright slumped in her chair, her composure gone entirely, eyes cast downward. The room seemed to hold its breath, recognizing the gravity of the revelation. The crime, long shrouded in misdirection, had finally been illuminated, not by mere evidence of touch or timing, but by the deeper, unsettling truth of the mind that had engineered it. Miss Marple, knitting slowly, allowed the weight of understanding to settle. The criminal's psychology had been revealed, exposing a motive far more disturbing than any he had anticipated: a chilling, calculated desire for control over the minds and actions of others, a game of human chess in which the pieces were real lives, and the stakes were measured not in currency but in fear, obedience, and observation. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the clock, as the magnitude of that hidden motive sank into every mind present. Miss Marple rose from her chair, the rhythmic clicking of her knitting needles falling silent. The room, still thick with tension from the revelation of motive, seemed to hold its breath. She had traced the threads of manipulation, observed the patterns of behavior, and now, with the criminal's psychology laid bare, she was ready for the final act. "Mrs. Cartwright," she said, her voice calm yet authoritative. "We have followed the sequence of events carefully, observed the subtle clues, and discerned the pattern you believed hidden. The evidence is clear, and the motives, no longer obscure, have been fully traced. The time has come to speak plainly." Mrs. Cartwright stiffened, her hands clenching in her lap. A flicker of panic crossed her face, but she forced a brittle composure, lifting her chin as if daring Miss Marple to proceed. "You believed yourself clever?" Miss Marple continued, moving slowly around the parlour as if the space itself were a chessboard. "You orchestrated the theft of the knight and the note, engineered Edward's disappearance, and manipulated every reaction in this house to measure your mastery over others. Each move was deliberate, calculated, and designed to intimidate and control. Yet, in doing so, you left the smallest traces, the scuff marks, the subtle misplacements, the micro-reactions that have led us here." Mrs. Cartwright's eyes darted toward the open window, then to the hallway, a flicker of desperation evident. I didn't mean any real harm," she exclaimed. "It was just a game. I only wanted to see if they would act as I expected." Miss Marple's gaze was steady, unyielding. A game, yes, but one played with real lives. Edward was endangered, and fear and confusion were weaponized against innocent people. That is no game, it is manipulation, and it has consequences. The room remained silent for a moment, the weight of truth pressing down. Then Mrs. Cartwright rose abruptly, her movements sharp and hurried. She made for the door, perhaps intending to flee, her eyes wide with panic. Hawthorne lunged instinctively, but Miss Marple raised a hand, stopping him. "Patience," she said softly. "Observe first." Mrs. Cartwright froze mid-step, glancing back, her confidence faltering under the careful scrutiny of the detective's calm eyes. Miss Marple continued, her tone unhurried but precise. "The outcome you see cannot be secured by flight. The evidence, the observations, the patterns, they all point to you. You may attempt to escape, but all paths have been anticipated. There is nowhere to go where your intentions remain hidden." A tremor ran through Mrs. Cartwright. Her shoulders slumped as if the act of running had been stripped of purpose. Slowly she turned to face Miss Marple, her composure completely unravelling. I didn't want to hurt anyone," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I just wanted to see if I could control it all, to see if my predictions were right. I never... Miss Marple nodded gently. "And that desire for control is precisely what led to these events. But now you must acknowledge the consequences, for manipulation, even when disguised as a test of intellect, is not without cost." Hawthorne stepped forward, his expression firm but not unkind. "You will come with us, Mrs. Cartwright. There will be questions to answer, but the pattern has been traced, and justice will follow." Mrs. Cartwright's eyes flick. Ked to the chessboard at the centre of the room, the pieces still arranged as if frozen mid-strategy. Her lips quivered, and she sank back into the nearest chair, the fight draining from her. It's all gone wrong," she muttered. "I thought I was clever enough." Miss Marple's expression softened ever so slightly. "Cleverness is no shield against scrutiny, Mrs. Cartwright. Every move leaves a mark, every manipulation a trace. Even the most subtle patterns, if observed carefully, can be unravelled." Outside the sun had fully set, casting the vicarage in twilight. The parlour, once the scene of confusion, manipulation, and fear, now held a sense of resolution. Edward, trembling but unharmed, stepped forward, his relief evident. The vicar exhaled deeply, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, while Mrs. Winslow's anxious features finally relaxed. Miss Marple, knitting needles idle once more, allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The game had been played, the patterns deciphered, and the orchestrator confronted. The criminal's psychology, the hidden motives, and the sequence of manipulation had all been laid bare. In the quiet aftermath, it was clear that the sharpest mind had won not by force or threat, but by careful observation, patience, and the unerring ability to see the truth that lay beneath appearances. And in that parlour, now still and hushed, the long, intricate game had finally reached its conclusion. The parlour had settled into an uneasy calm. Edward had been reassured, the vicar's hands relaxed slightly, and even Mrs. Winslow's anxious eyes seemed to soften as the immediate danger appeared to have passed. Mrs. Cartwright, now subdued and silent, sat with her head bowed, leaving Miss Marple to reflect on the chain of events. Every detail she had observed, the subtle gestures, the sequence of manipulation, the psychological games, had led her to a coherent resolution, or so it seemed. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, yet her mind, as always, was far from idle. Something, a faint discomfort that had nagged at her throughout the confrontation, tugged insistently at her thoughts. She glanced around the room again, her gaze lingering on the vicar, the fireplace, and the chessboard. Then her eyes caught the faintest trace on the carpet near the sideboard, a pattern of small indentations too deliberate to be random, too precise to belong to anyone who had moved casually about the room. She rose, moving slowly toward the mark, her hands steady. "Inspector Hawthorne," she said, her voice quiet but urgent, "would you mind stepping over here?" Hawthorne came at once, eyebrows raised. "What now?" Miss Marple indicated the slight indentations. "Observe these. They are subtle, almost invisible unless one is looking for them. But notice the spacing, the pressure, and the direction. They do not match the movements of Mrs. Cartwright, Edward, or anyone else we have accounted for. Someone has been here recently, after we believed the case closed, leaving a final trace. And it points to an entirely unexpected participant." The vicar looked puzzled, frowning. "Who could that be?" Miss Marple's lips curved faintly in a knowing smile. "Look closer at the details you have overlooked. The perfume lingering from the previous theft, the precise handling of objects in the room, and the way the chessboard was subtly adjusted. Each points to someone who has been present all along, unnoticed in plain sight." She paused, letting the silence build. Then, gently but firmly, she looked toward Mrs. Winslow. "It is you, Mrs. Winslow. You orchestrated more than petty anxiety. While Mrs. Cartwright executed the psychological maneuvers, you, subtly, quietly, have been guiding events from behind the scenes, ensuring that Edward would be implicat. Ed, that tension would escalate, and that misdirection would keep the attention off your hand." Mrs. Winslow stiffened, her face paling. She opened her mouth to protest, but Miss Marple held up a hand. "Consider the evidence, the careful placement of items, the quiet movements, the hints in conversation designed to provoke specific reactions. It was you who removed the knight and the note, who used the patterns of observation to mislead us, and who ensured the disappearance of Edward would create maximum confusion." The room froze. Even the vicar gasped, clutching the arm of his chair. Edward's eyes widened, as if a new layer of the labyrinth had suddenly opened before him. Mrs. Cartwright, still seated, blinked rapidly, her own shock plain. Mrs. Winslow's voice trembled as she finally spoke. I didn't mean to. I only wanted to protect, to control it before anyone else got hurt." Miss Marple nodded, her expression calm but piercing. "Ah, yes, control again, the same desire that drove Mrs. Cartwright. But where she sought mastery over reactions, you sought mastery over the course of events themselves. You believed that by guiding the sequence, ensuring the clues appeared as you wished, and subtly steering perception, you could shape outcomes perfectly. And in doing so, you became the hidden architect behind the entire drama." Hawthorne took a deep breath, stepping closer. "So all of this, it wasn't Mrs. Cartwright acting alone?" "Precisely," Miss Marple replied. Cartwright was the visible hand, the one the patterns pointed to at first glance. You, Mrs. Winslow, were the shadow mind, nudging and shaping, ensuring the outcome aligned with your expectations. The true genius, and danger, has always been here, quietly influencing, unseen because no one suspected her subtlety." Mrs. Winslow slumped into her chair, her facade of calm utterly shattered. "I only wanted to prevent harm. I didn't know how far it would go." Miss Marple's eyes softened slightly. "Intentions are not always the measure of impact. The consequences were real and the manipulation profound, but now the veil has been lifted. The mastermind, hidden in plain sight, has been revealed." The room was silent, charged with the shock of revelation. Outside, the last light of dusk faded, casting long shadows across the vicarage floor. The case, thought concluded, had sprung its final twist, proving that even when all pieces seem accounted for, the mind capable of subtle orchestration can remain several steps ahead, until a truly perceptive observer discerns the hidden pattern. And in this room, Miss Marple had done precisely that. The parlour had grown hushed, the fading light outside casting long, sombre shadows across the walls. Mrs. Winslow remained seated, her composure fractured, her hands trembling as she tried, and failed, to reconcile the revelation with her self-image. Miss Marple, serene and composed, regarded her with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent decades reading human nature as easily as one reads a book. Hawthorne, still struggling to grasp the full scope of the deception, looked from Mrs. Winslow to Miss Marple, searching for guidance. "Inspector," Miss Marple began softly, her voice cutting through the tension, "you see now why what seemed a straightforward series of events was anything but. The chess piece, the note, Edward's disappearance. They were merely instruments. The orchestrator's true aim was manipulation, influence, and control. And while Mrs. Cartwright played her visible role, it was Mrs. Winslow who shaped the sequence, concealed in plain sight, altering outcomes and perceptions with subtlety that could fool all but the most observant." Hawthorne ran a hand through his hair, finally letting out a long sigh. "I suppose the physical clues were never enough. We were looking at what was touched, stolen, or moved, but never at how the minds of the participants were being steered." "Exactly," Miss Marple replied. "Notice the small details that initially seemed inconsequential, the faint perfume near the sideboard, the micro-adjustments of the chess pieces, the careful monitoring of reactions during the tea games. All of these were cues, left deliberately by Mrs. Winslow to gauge and guide responses. Most overlooked them, considering them trivial, yet they were part of a hidden language. Observe closely, and the invisible thread becomes plain." She paused, letting the words sink in, then gestured toward the chessboard. "Take the bishop," leaning slightly toward the desk. It was a signal, unnoticed, pointing us to the location of the most telling evidence. The small scratches and indentations on the desk and floor were minor, yet consistent with the sequence of movements orchestrated by the mastermind. Each act left traces, but they required a mind attuned to patterns, subtlety, and timing to interpret correctly. That is why the game could have gone unnoticed if not for patient observation and the recognition of psychological motives alongside physical evidence. Mrs. Winslow's voice broke as she spoke, barely above a whisper. I didn't think anyone would see. I only wanted to ensure things didn't go wrong, to guide them, to prevent mistakes." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And therein lies the danger. When one confuses manipulation with protection, control with guidance, the consequences extend beyond intention. Lives are affected, fear is sown, chaos unfolds. The smaller the cues, the more invisible the orchestration, the more effective the influence, and the harder it is to discern. But not impossible, as we have demonstrated." Edward, still pale, stepped closer, his relief tempered by lingering confuse. "Ion. So the real danger was all along in someone we trusted." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Trust is fragile, dear boy. It can be exploited when combined with skill, patience, and a desire for control. But even the most careful orchestration leaves subtle evidence. The micro-traces, the minute changes in routine, the unintended reactions, the marks and placements overlooked by others, these are what reveal the truth." Hawthorne exhaled, a mix of frustration and admiration in his expression. "And you saw it all? The pattern, the motives, the hidden hand behind it?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "That is the privilege of attention to detail, combined with understanding the nature of human behavior. The criminal may escape notice if one only observes the surface, but every action, however subtle, leaves a signature, and the mind that orchestrates the outcome cannot help but mark it, even inadvertently. That is why we were able to discern the unseen hand." For a long moment the room remained still, a fragile quiet settling over it. Mrs. Winslow, the hidden mastermind, was now fully exposed, yet her motivations, twisted by fear, obsession, and a need for control, left an unsettling impression. Justice, in its formal sense, would follow through the authorities, yet the moral weight of the actions lingered in the room like a shadow, unresolved and chilling. Miss Marple, knitting needles once more resting idly, allowed a soft, knowing smile to cross her face. The game had ended, the pattern revealed, the psychology of the criminal laid bare, yet the faint sense of unfinished business lingered, a reminder that human nature can be as intricate and unpredictable as the most complex of chess strategies. And in that quiet, the detective's insight had triumphed, not by force nor by accusation, but by seeing what everyone else had missed patiently and unerringly, until the hidden truth could no longer remain concealed. The vicarage had settled into an uneasy quiet by the time Miss Marple and Inspector Hawthorne stepped onto the cool evening path, leaving behind the parlour, its shadows now softened by the fading light. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of autumn leaves, and the gentle chirp of distant crickets provided a fragile semblance of calm after the day's upheaval. Edward had been reassured, the vicar's nerves steadied, and Mrs. Winslow was now in custody, her hidden manipulations exposed. The case, by every outward measure, seemed resolved, yet Miss Marple's mind, ever alert, remained attuned to the subtleties that lingered beneath the surface. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning the garden path, the hedgerows, the faint outline of the village beyond, as if the clues she had observed inside the vicarage had left a lingering trail in the world itself. Hawthorne, noting her contemplative expression, fell into step Bess. "Eyed her. You're not satisfied," he observed, a trace of exasperation in his tone. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her gaze thoughtful. "Satisfaction is a fragile thing, Inspector. The criminal's actions have been traced, the motive revealed, yet the mind capable of such careful orchestration leaves subtler signs, questions that linger even after apparent closure." Hawthorne frowned. "You mean there's something else we missed?" "Perhaps nothing grave," she replied, "but consider the minor details that seemed unimportant, the faint scuff marks by the library door, the slightly displaced book on the shelf, and that subtle alignment of the chess pieces. All pointed to Mrs. Winslow's orchestration, yet there is one small anomaly, a detail that does not entirely fit, that I cannot yet explain." The inspector glanced at her sharply. "Anomalies are dangerous, Miss Marple. You think we've solved the case, yet you're already questioning it." She nodded, her eyes reflecting the last rays of the sun. "That is the way of mysteries. They never end completely. There is always a trace, a subtle echo, a faint question that remains in the mind long after the visible evidence has been accounted for. Consider the note, the timing, the subtle psychological tests. Everything fits, except for one small moment, one gesture that cannot yet be explained. It is as if the criminal in her cleverness left a seed of uncertainty." Hawthorne looked uneasy. "You mean she planned it all and still left a loose thread? Just to taunt us?" "Not to taunt," Miss Marple said softly, "but perhaps because human behaviour is never entirely predictable, even to the most meticulous mind. And sometimes the patterns we observe hint at connections we have yet to see. One cannot ever be entirely certain that the story is fully told." They continued walking in silence, the village's warm glow in the distance contrasting with the lingering tension in Miss Marple's mind. Her thoughts returned to the chessboard, to the careful placements, the micro-reactions, and the faint perfume trail that had first drawn her suspicion. All had led to the revelation of Mrs. Winslow's hidden orchestration. Yet one faint detail, an almost imperceptible smudge on the corner of the vicar's desk, remained unaccounted for. A triviality, perhaps, or a clue to another subtle layer of deception. Hawthorne noticed her pause and looked at her. "You're thinking someone else was involved?" Miss Marple shook her head lightly. "Not necessarily involved in the same crime, but life is rarely as tidy as we wish. Every act leaves traces, and every mind is capable of hidden patterns. The case may be closed in the eyes of the law, yet the human heart, the motivations, the subtle manipulations, those can ripple outward in ways we may only discover later." As they reached the village green, the lights of the houses twinkling through the early night mist, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. The immediate danger was past, the criminal unmasked, the lessons learned, but the quiet thrill of the unsolved, the trace of the unexpected, remained alive. Mysteries, she knew, have a persistence all their own. They wait patiently, lingering in the corners of perception, ready to emerge when the mind least expects it. Hawthorne turned to her, curiosity and admiration mingled in his expression. "And you expect another turn, perhaps another challenge?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, the faintest gleam of anticipation catching the moonlight. "Oh, Inspector, one never knows when the next puzzle will present itself. Life, after all, is full of small secrets, subtle deviations, and quiet manipulations. The world is a chessboard, and the pieces, Well, they are always moving, even when we are certain the game is done. They walked on, the vicar, rage now behind them, the village calm but holding its own untold stories. And though justice had been served, a small question lingered, an unfinished thread that promised the next mystery, patiently waiting for the mind keen enough to perceive it. In the quiet of the night, with the stars beginning to glimmer above, Miss Marple knew the game would continue, and she would be ready.